While Michael Tippett composed A Child of Our Time between 1939 and 1941, right at the start of the Second World War, Tippett's inspiration goes back further than that, and his influences were diverse. Tippett spent the 1930s trying to establish himself as a composer, but it took time for him to develop his musical style. He didn't complete his Opus 1, a string quartet, until 1935, when he was around 30 years old. After that, he wanted to turn his attention to something bigger, a work that would express all that he wanted to say about the state of the world. To be sure, the world that Tippett wanted to describe was in turmoil. The Great Depression raged, and Tippett was alarmed by the rise of fascism across Europe. And Tippett's own life was in turmoil. Following a failed love affair, Tippett underwent psychotherapy, becoming well-versed in the ideas of Carl Jung. It was in 1937, against this backdrop, that Tippett began sketching a three-part choral work, which he called Nikia. This work was heavily influenced by his therapy, taking as its theme the reconciliation between humanity's dark side, its shadow, and its light side, the good, as a way toward peace. Tippett eventually scrapped this idea, deciding instead to write a more politically charged opera on the Easter Rising, the Irish Rebellion of 1916. Through all this, we sense Tippett struggling to reconcile these ideas and to latch onto a personal philosophy that could guide him. Tippett was always a socially aware composer, and he first thought that revolutionary communism might be the solution, but he eventually adopted a stance of radical nonviolence and pacifism. Tippett would soon find the inspiration for his next work. In 1938, he learned of the story of Herschel Greenspan, the Jewish refugee who shot and killed a German officer, which the Nazis would use to justify their vicious pogrom against the Jews, the Night of Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht. Here, Tippett had found his story. Violence against one person had brought out violence against an entire race of people, and this threatened to spin out of control and plunge an entire world into war. Tippett wanted to point to pacifism and the philosophy of Jung as a way out of this madness, so he set about writing a libretto for his new work. He turned for help to the famous poet T.S. Eliot, who suggested that Tippett complete it on his own, advising him to avoid language that was overtly poetic or polished, as it might draw attention away from the music. With that advice, Tippett completed his libretto, transforming the specifics of the story into more universalized characters and events. Tippett began writing the music for his new work, first called Sketch for a Modern Oratorio and later A Child of Our Time, on September 3, 1939, the day the British declared war on Germany. The structure of the work was heavily influenced by Baroque models like the oratorios of Handel and the Passions of Bach, and the division in the world is represented musically by dissonant fugues. Other movements show the influence of jazz, but it was Tippett's decision to use African-American spirituals at key moments in the oratorio that gave the work its most memorable feature. We need to consider what Tippett was trying to accomplish here. He sought to link these spirituals with Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, that is, a collection of knowledge and imagery that is shared by all people, springing up at moments of crisis. He felt these spirituals expressed something deep and profound within the human psyche, but he was also drawing parallels between the treatment of Jewish people in Europe and the historical oppression of Black people in the United States. We should also acknowledge the debt that Tippett's spiritual arrangements owe to some key musicians. As source material, he used a collection published by the brothers James Weldon Johnson and J. Rosamond Johnson, noted civil rights activists who also wrote the famous hymn, Lift Every Voice and Sing. Tippett's arrangements take on structural, rhythmic, and even some specific harmonic choices used in J. Rosamond Johnson's musical settings. Tippett's work also was inspired by the brilliant choir director Hall Johnson's spiritual arrangements. This influence is shown by Tippett's handling of soloists as musical leaders within the choral texture. Tippett completed his work on A Child of Our Time in 1941, but he set the piece aside to pursue other projects. In 1943, he was jailed for refusing military service. His supporters included two of Britain's most famous composers, Ralph Vaughan Williams and Benjamin Britten. It was Britten, along with his partner Peter Pears, who encouraged Tippett to stage A Child of Our Time, and the pair personally put up a third of its cost. The work was finally premiered on March 19, 1944. The Germans had been bombing London, but nothing fell on the city that night, and the premiere was a great success. The universalized quality of A Child of Our Time has allowed it to remain in the repertoire, and it is often seen as a prophetic work. The pacifist sentiments of the piece spoke to a generation of Europeans who, after World War II, hoped never to fight again. But its message spread far beyond European shores. Herschel Greenspan's own father had survived the war, and in 1962, by that time an old man, heard the work performed in Israel. Tippett was moved to hear American audiences sing along to the spirituals during performances of A Child of Our Time in the 1960s, at the height of the civil rights movement. In the 1970s and 80s, the message of the work resonated with those who were fighting against communist regimes, and in recent years, the image of the refugee has found parallels with strife in Syria and Eastern Europe. In his time, Michael Tippett was considered one of England's greatest composers. A Child of Our Time remains the most performed and well-known work from this 20th century British master, an oratorio that continues to speak to us in our time.